We're in the expert panel session, and today I thought maybe I have a few questions for the panel, and hopefully that'll leave for questions in your mind. We did have some questions earlier that we didn't answer that we should probably thinking about addressing. So panelists, if there's a question that was posed to you that you think is appropriate for the panel, just put your hand up and we'll handle that. You know, when I talk about these types of technologies, microservices, APIs, and integration, you know, when you get started on these types of projects, a lot of customers ask me, you know, how do I get started and how do I put that business case together to actually put in front of the business owners to say, look, we need to make investments in API management, or we need to make investments in integration or containers, or should we do microservices, right? So maybe for the panel, whoever wants to answer it first, how do you approach the business to ask that question and put together a business case for investment in technology? Who would like to go first? Usually the analyst goes first, right?
Building a business case for APIs. Yeah, so this is something that clients I have struggle with this, figuring out how to start with APIs. And you know, Steve made the really great point that, you know, like when you build an API that doesn't have a backing business plan, chances are you're going to be in trouble. And the climate right now, I think we've been talking about this as we, get together for these sorts of events. There's a little bit of almost like a viciousness that's happening inside of IT organizations now where, this point about bimodal IT where there's the digital people and everyone else. Everyone else wants the digital people to fail. And, so there's very much a prayer for failure that's happening inside of IT organizations because there's a lot of resentment about how that got implemented. And that was like, I keep saying that. And so what happens is when you do APIs, they tend to be associated with these digital initiatives that everyone hopes will fail. So, and so if you do it on a hope-based, like the most common thing that I see is, we'll either start it by putting some assets that we have that are not really too risky out there for people to access, through automation. So maybe econometric data if it's a bank, or other low-risk sorts of projects to see if they get any usage, and of course they don't. And then the other thing that happens is people say, okay, we want to be part of the platform economy, digital platform economy. So we've got these really cool assets. We'll expose them as APIs, and then you'll be able to use these services that we do really well. And those things those are sort of MVP. They're minimally viable services, and those don't do particularly well either. And so part of the issue is when you think about the business plan of doing an API, the points that were made were really good. How is it tied to a process? How is it going to improve the ups? So a couple things. First off, am I solving a problem that is causing me to lose customers? Or am I solving a problem that's going to allow us to be operationally more efficient so that we can trace it to, cost reduction? Really classic things. And there's so much focus on automation right now that, if you can't associate it with things that improve how you operate with partners, where you can actually show that you're easier to work with, or until you can show that through this automation, you'll be able to bill faster, you'll be able to close business faster, you'll be able to not have so much labor intensity to solve particular problems, then if you can't get to those sort of standard ROIs out of the project, then you're probably doing field of dreams. And so it's just talk to people. You do have to, product management, what they do is they interview people to figure out where gaps are. And then they start identifying enough of them and build a business case around how complicated it would be to fix the gap and what the benefits are if the gap is fixed. So ideally, what you'll come up with as you go interview is you'll come up with 4 or 5 ideas, And then you start building the business case around each of those ideas, cost and benefit, and you'll find one that makes sense. So that would be my recommendation. So planning, front load this effort with planning, in other words. Does that make sense? Absolutely. You want to?
Anybody else want to add something?
Yes, Steve. You should have that anyway. So.
No, you said it all. I think just to reinforce that, and just, there's some concrete things that fall out of it as well. There's, I think, a very different kind of scenario if you're internal or external APIs in some ways, but the underlying logic is the same. So if I think of the customers that have been wildly successful with APIs and made the case, and actually, because you don't want to make the case and then fall on your face, right? Because the next time you make the case for some other technology, no one's going to listen to you. So you actually want to make sure the case is solid. But the points where the cases got made and it really worked are the ones where, on the public-facing side, the public-facing APIs were related to the core mission of the organization, right? So if you're a car hire company, and this Maureen said exactly this as well, is that you do APIs for driving more car hires or more customer satisfaction or something like that, right? You could do an API for, driving data, right? So that's nice, it's a marketing exercise and so on, right? You might even be able to sell the driving data, but is it really going to be any more than 1% of your revenues? Probably not. So you need to make a revenue argument in general, and that's also the APIs that are successful. On the inside, is the same, right? It's got to be solving a fundamental problem in your organization. Could be efficiency of implementations. It could be the go-to-market of some new revenue streams that the company wants to implement, like a partner program or something like that. But very often when it's really internal, they tend to be, can we make people processes more efficient? And I think we're seeing more and more now with the kind of advent of more drag-and-drop integration, kind of iPaaS type of scenarios where less technical folks can do integrations. That's one area where API programs, it's much easier to make the justifications. It's like, well, if we've got endpoints onto our systems, then our non-specialists can get stuff done without having to wait 3 months for IT to do it, right? So that's a justification which seems to be working, I see more and more.
Sorry, I should have let the people on the panel who haven't been on stage yet introduce themselves and their role within Red Hat. And Keith, you just came up, so I think that would be a good segue for you to introduce yourself and your role.
Hey, I'm Keith Babbo. I'm the product manager for Fuse. I crashed the panel.
Yeah, it's the first time I've actually seen that happen.
Mainly because I wanted to take that security question about containers. I thought it was really cool. Yeah, so.
Yeah, the panelists are very happy that you're going to take that, apparently.
All right, cool.
Christian bounced that.
Yeah. So it's a great question. It's not that containers are this like magic.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure.
Yes.
So I believe the question was like there's a position that's being advanced that containers offer more security, right? And but why is that? Basically, like how do you substantiate that? And it's not that containers, of course, are some kind of magic potion that you can sprinkle on code and that just suddenly all the CVEs and security issues go away. But there's some fundamental things about containers that if they're used correctly, you have a much better security posture, right? So like a couple of them, or a few of them, one is that all containers run as single processes, Linux processes, right? Which means they're isolated from any other code that is running. So when you have a secure host operating system like RHEL that natively supports containers, you can lock down those individual containers and they can't actually collide or invade one another, right? You can also do things with like C groups where you can actually limit what they can get at. So in terms of there's like zombie or kind of ghost devices or all these other kind of exploits that are very common, there's a standard way in RHEL to lock those down. But really another important thing is the fact that containers are layered like a cake. So when a container itself is the transitive enclosure of your application and everything it depends on, all the way down to the operating system, right? But all those come in layers, so that when you have a JDK bug or an OS bug, that layer can be updated, and you can basically rebuild that container image without touching your app, and then layer that in. So the frequency and the ease with which you can do automated updates make it a healthier environment compared to like maybe an app server that you have to take it down, you have to rebuild the whole thing, apply the patch, and then re-roll it out in a very kind of complex deployment structure, instead of like a container managed infrastructure where you can do a rolling upgrade and you never see any service outage, right? And then the other thing I'll mention is that container registries, like Red Hat has our container registry, where we run scans of all the images that we have there all the time for CVEs. So you know right away, like, oh, I'm using this image and it has a B or C or D grade. Like, that seems problematic, right? Of course, our grades are always A. But, so that's more visibility that you don't normally have unless you're, like, subscribed to these CVE registries and you have a really good idea of exactly what's deployed in your application. With a container image, you just say, oh, yep, everything that this container does and every layer below it has been scanned, and it doesn't have any active bugs. Critical vulnerability exploit or something?
Exploit.
Yeah. So basically, CVE is it's like a database of all security exploits that are known. So security researchers will go find issues, and then they'll file them in this kind of centralized database, and then vendors will collaborate and then issue updates or patches that comply with those CVEs. So like the struts issue that was like really big a while ago, there was a CVE that was identified for that to describe the problem.
No, he did a great job.
We had multiple container images, and say, for example, the SSL had CVEs released. How do we get notified? What tools do you have that's built in there that we can find out if one of those container images has a CVE?
Right. So I don't know how all other vendors handle this, but we do it with errata. So basically, you get an automated update when we release new images that contain CVE fixes, and then the errata process is a notification via email or support portal that says basically, hey, all these new images have been released, and these CVEs are fixed in those images.
But you know how, like in satellite, when we have those erratas, we can see the CVEs for each of the packages.
Yeah.
But within a container that has the packages, how is there a way that we will be able to find out, or do we have to manually notify or understand how our containers are built?
It's a great question. So I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if like CloudForms actually provides an ad hoc reporting mechanism for discovering that. It's certainly possible because the raw data is there, and then you know the image streams and the images that you're running in every container. I just don't know if there's a tool chain that sits on top of that yet. Oh yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that's right. You can do an OpenSCAP scan. That's right.
OpenSCAP scan.
Yeah. So, see, Christian does have the answers.
Okay.
Christian, maybe you should introduce yourself. If you could move that mic down to Christian. We're getting very technical very fast here.
My name's Christian Posta. I'm a chief architect at Red Hat. I help our customers build applications, APIs, integrations from the container level on up.
Great. Does anybody else want to answer the security question? I think we've... No. Okay. Getting back to the business case, one thing I wanted to add maybe to that discussion is, having been a former global CTO and being responsible for the strategy for a large company, there was a couple tactics I used to instantiate in the board's mind as well as the CEO, like we need to make investments in APIs or whatever internal IT investment it is. Usually I'd like to draw or put together a picture of that new digital experience that can be enabled through whatever technology, be it APIs, microservices, whatever, so they understand how the client interfaces with the customer or how the customer interfaces with the company has been changed and how it's enabled, et cetera. So that's one thing. It doesn't have to be, when we talk business cases, we usually think about quantifying the numbers and it's all about financial metrics. It doesn't have to be. The other tactic I used was, the competition's doing it or thinking about doing it. And it's almost fear-mongering, but at the end of the day, we're typically building, nowadays more than ever, new digital experiences for our customers so that they identify the brand, that you're actually really selling trust to the market that what you're providing to them, they understand and will use. So a couple little tactics there that you can put into the business case to help support that investment. Was there any other questions? We handled the security one right away. There was, I think, another question around government and sort of the inhibitors of government to get to cloud. Is anybody else on stage want to have any experience around handling that question? I know on the Canadian side of things, I deal with all the governments across Canada, including the feds, the provinces, the cities, the municipalities. I think, finally, the public cloud vendors in Canada really have the offers required for public sector kind of requirements, backup data centers and things like that. And they can, if you involve the right parties, you can have data sovereignty, keep the data within Canada. I think a lot of governments are still concerned about how the public clouds actually work. I'm surprised the congressmen in the U.S. are able to articulate and put together a policy around that. But I think there's a misunderstanding, a little bit of fear. I think government organizations in general, I think a key aspect on the private and public side of things, you got to have somebody that understands public clouds. That key role I find that organizations are looking for are the cloud architect who understands the philosophies, the process, the mentality of running something in a public cloud. They understand cloud native applications. So finding those key resources that can evangelize internally to say what the benefits of public cloud and how do we handle all the objections that come out of the organization who are used to doing things a certain way. That institutional memory, that's been another major inhibitor, I think, within government in Canada. But I think, I'm going to make a bold statement. I think this year is kind of that year. I think you used the term public cloud being kind of a mainstay or default position in the U.S. I think that's coming into Canada this year for a number of reasons. I think companies are also trying to figure out how do I do my job in the public cloud? How does it change? So just to answer that question on the government side of things. And we have a question up front here.
Mike,
Go ahead.
real quick, can I
Oh,
just follow
one.
on real quick? So just real quick point on that if it doesn't have to be public cloud, right? So there's inherent kind of features and architectural goodness about just cloud in general, whether it's public or private. And so when we look at it, even if from a regulation standpoint or laws or whatever, or for any number of reasons, you don't want to go to public cloud, going to private cloud now has a whole host of benefits. And if you choose a platform, like let's say OpenShift based on Kubernetes, that is portable to public clouds, that allows you to get there eventually when the government is ready, right? Then that's a great posture to adopt now. That's a technology adoption cycle that you can begin now, get used to cloud native development with containers on premise, right, in your own data center, virtualized infrastructure, and then roll out to public cloud when it's available.
Yeah, and precisely the BC Dev Exchange here locally in Victoria, that was one of their main principles that they abided by doing an on-site private cloud on OpenShift. Get the organization prepared for when they actually go to public cloud.
I just want to say, just adding to that, a lot of times the hardest part about it is moving data and managing data. And so when you have faster cycles focusing on the application logic for whatever you're doing. So the staging is, staging it all private to begin with, it gives you an opportunity to stage it onto the public cloud and figure out what redesign has to go into the data, before you move it. So the cycles are different. The length of time it takes on the data side is longer than the application logic. I'm not saying absolutely all the time, but typically.
Yeah, there's usually some foundational infrastructure and systems, Active Directory structures, data structures,
a lot of
pipes,
design work,
that it has to be done to prepare yourself for public cloud. Yeah. There was a question over here. Go ahead.
Hi. At a few different instances you guys mentioned about, so when there are microservices, APIs, and there was a question about the versioning, and you mentioned at some points you might just have to turn it off to see who complains. I'm curious about, does 3Scale, or is it usually an API management platform that gets involved to do access control, to be able to keep track of your users? I understand that you can have a registry for your API itself, so me as a user can go to that registry and be like, oh, this is the address for me to be able to hit that API. On the other hand, is there other component of it where I have to register to be able to access that particular API? I know for Amazon, you get a key and then you use that as a cert, so they know that I'm accessing X number of times so that they can charge me accordingly. So is this something that's usually, like, I can also see this bloating up a specific API a lot, increasing the amount of work. So is that usually, from an architecture standpoint, something that the management framework, the management layer, or the 3Scale that you guys are talking about, that's something that it takes care of, or is it something that individual APIs have to develop and enable themselves?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that's one of the functions of the API management layer. 3Scale specifically does that, right? So the system has two levels. It has a policy management, analytics, and user tracking, and kind of sign up and things for APIs, and then it has the enforcement. So enforcement points are gateways that you put wherever you want in your organization. You can have as many as you want, that sit in front of the APIs themselves and enforce policies. And there's multiple of those. But the point is that you have control points, but for someone to access an API, you can decide what the policy is, but typically you at least want to know who the person is and which application is accessing. So you may have one developer that is responsible for your 3 primary applications, but those are distinct applications. If you have a problem on one of them, you may want to throttle it or shut it down without affecting the other 2. So you want to build this relationship between, on the one side, the APIs, on the second side, the people who are managing the code that's calling the APIs, and then the code itself, what keys it's using and so on. So when you get to this versioning kind of moment, you can just message all the people who are currently have applications on an API and tell them, hey, by the way, you now have 3 months to change. And here's the link to the new API, here's the documentation, go check it out. If you don't have that, so the examples I was giving of the switching a service off, if you don't know who the people are, then that's kind of what you're left with, right? You don't even know who to communicate with. So yeah, the platform manages those relationships. You can be strict on approval processes and all sorts of things. If you want to have APIs very locked down, you may want to do that if you want to have very restricted partner programs that are external. Or you can just have it self-serve, right? So someone can just sign up and use it. And we have kind of a fun metric is the time to first hello world. Like how long does it take a developer who wakes up at 2 o'clock in the morning and decides to use an API, how long does it take them to actually send a call and get a result? And ideally, if you're self-serve, it takes very little time. So yeah, you want to automate as much as possible, but for some APIs, you may want to lock them down. And maybe even charge internally. Like some people do cost accounting as to what usage is.
Thank you.
So we've opened up to the floor. Is there any other questions out there? Yeah, we got a question in the front here.
Thanks. Maureen, you had a slide in your deck that talked about the twin challenges of avoiding vendor lock-in and avoiding developer lock-in. And I'm wondering if you could, or the rest of the panel could talk a little bit about your experiences with organizations and how they're tackling those challenges, because I don't see them necessarily as either or scenarios. They're kind of both in parallel in some way.
I think for me, I started thinking through this with especially when I was starting to see some really interesting projects that were successful using community open source. So 0 software cost, and the developers implement off community. And so for me, it wasn't about, oh, they're failing, because they weren't. I mean, in some cases, they were more successful than the more expensive alternatives that were from proprietary. So I will say that. But what happens is that they get to a level where the focus is more on making it work, but not managing it. And so this ongoing change management, documentation, understanding the system, became really problematic, especially as it worked so well, it became an important application or system in the organization. And so at that point, the question is, if a developer leaves, then what happens to that really important system that's not documented that well? And so that's when you start feeling like you're a developer locked in, because you can't have the development team leave without posing risk. And so from that perspective, business and senior IT start to notice that they are at risk on that. Not that they were against the product, just the long-term sustainability and the cost, because effectively what they were having to make a decision about is, do we build a product that compete with commercial software out there, or do we just re-platform to that commercial software? So from that perspective, they were basically being willing to use the commercial just because they got the benefits, and for them the selection then tilted toward which vendors are going to be good partners, right? If it's an important system, are they maintaining it? Are they growing it? Does it take forever to get anything changed? So it becomes a whole conversation about how well that software company acts as a partner over time, as opposed to lock-in, because they recognize that there is going to be an element of lock-in with it because you're picking a commercial product. But they've made the assessment that their risk is less with that if they pick the right partner than it is with locking into a development team where they may no longer be there, or the different management aspects of it are in place. And I worked on a project last year where that exact same thing happened. They got worried, they got worried because they had this thing working really well, but they also knew that they needed to do additional things to it. So when we built out how to solve for the problem, we added API management. So sometimes you don't have to make a business case, you just add it and then you develop for that. But we added API management, we added some more reliable messaging, and a couple of other things into it to make it a more development environment and all that other stuff to make it make more sense for them for a long-term basis to be able to evolve the system. And the other piece is replatforming it around microservices was also a big thing. So they did a lot of change to it, but off of a system that worked really well. But they needed to do it for safety in that case. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it strikes me that it's an ongoing intentional process of risk management, or management, governance, and risk mitigation, a bit of vendor management and intentional evaluation, a bit of management of internal processes around your development, giving it your governance some teeth, to use an example from one of the earlier slides, and staying out in front of it. And also maybe, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but also making sure that you've got everybody at the table, right? You've got your vendors at the table, you've got your developers at the table, and you're actually collaborating on this risk to say, look, we want to make sure that we're protected as an organization, but we don't want to have it, well, you're over here and we're over here. It's a collaborative process.
Right. The other thing too, just as an add-on to it, one of the things that happens that is I'm really struggling with is seeing continued really bad decisions about purchasing software. And so one is that everyone knows we're supposed to experiment, right, and get to a proof of concept that makes sense, that can sort of lead to something that's worthy to be operationalized. Open source, as cheap, as much open source as you can put in those experimental things make the most sense, because you're not committing to something that goes into, you're not spending money on the software while you're experimenting. And what ends up happening, so here's the thing about this bimodal thing, it is, in some cases, if you're a digital person, you overbuy software that they don't even know if it works or not. And then they're reinventing the same problem that we've been going through for years. So the thing that's great about using open source is that you can get to a point where it works, and then you cut away to operationalize it into things that are worthy to be operationalized. So that was the other point that for me is that whole way to think about doing it.
I think a lot of organizations I talk to, they're always trying to abstract out the vendors if they can. Put an abstraction layer, APIs, maybe products that work in all the public clouds, and abstract out those services that the public clouds provide. And I think you touched a little bit on that this morning, Maureen, with the Oracle Cloud and how you can, you want to do that. As a businessman, my former job, why would I ever close a door on something? I never want to be cornered that I have to be tied to a certain supplier in my supply chain.
There's lots of good reasons people adopt Oracle Cloud.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I know, but just to say,
Yeah.
I don't want to go totally negative on them because they don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Somewhat. But
Yeah.
there are other reasons.
Yeah.
That
I guess.
Really worried.
Yeah, we call it open source, and the main word there is open, right? It is open. So if you want to make a change, most of the open source will work in most of the public clouds. So I think somebody else wanted to make a comment. Steve?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question of Christian and Samir, actually. So just kind of following on this thread of developer lock-in and then your vendor lock-in, there's also architectural lock-in, right? Because you're making these big decisions which have a lot of effect. Right now we hear these buzzwords, we hear like microservices and containers, and then we've got, you were just talking about distributed integration, for example, getting away from the ESB. So these are things that sometimes customers come to us with in their minds, or we put them in their minds. So especially for microservices, probably for you, microservices and containers, and for just like getting rid of the ESB, going to more distributed, what actually works and what doesn't, right? Because some of it's industry-driven hype, and some of it's, hey, there's a real benefit. So do you have a sense of how to separate those?
Yeah, and you said it right, that there is a lot of hype. I feel like every 10 years we get into this new technology hype. About 10 years ago or a little over, it was SOA and ESBs and conference talks and papers and analysts, and everybody comes together and we start talking about this stuff. At the end of the day, though, I mean, I don't know how to phrase this properly in terms of lock-in per se, but at the end of the day, you're trying to grow the business. You're trying to bring new value to your customers. So microservices, especially that word, bothers me. It just implies that, oh, well, now we have to make even smaller services because the old big services didn't work. When, in fact, they actually did. You're probably creating a lot of revenue off of the services that you have right now, but you're trying to go faster. You're trying to optimize for a different purpose now. And using services and containers, that's an approach today to help you go faster, but it's not the only thing that can help you go faster. A lot of automation and how your groups interact with each other, and the maturity around doing deployments and config management. These types of things are all critically important and enable you to go faster. So it's not just getting distracted with the hype of a particular application architecture style, because that by itself won't be the solution.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I mean, when you look at distributed integration, right, this is kind of my experience, right? If you look at 15, 20 years back, a lot of systems were distributed, right? Before the advent of EAI, those tools, integration was with each application, right? So when EAI was developed or ESBs were developed, they were became centralized for a reason, because there was a big problem with sprawl. And if you go back 10 years back, and if you look at vendors putting their slides, it was like, oh, this is all the spaghetti code. You put everything here. Now it solved all your problems, right? And it did solve some of the problems. It did, right? At those times, it solved the problems. What we're seeing is that as an industry, right, we keep moving this thing. So now it's kind of like, okay, now that became a problem, because previously with those distributed things, there was not really any standard of how you actually develop those applications, right? How you actually scale those applications. What's happening now is that now with containers coming in, with enterprise integration patterns, you're kind of seeing some kind of standards being developed where these type of distributed things are actually possible. But I would still caution that when you now embark on that journey of distributing it, the other challenge that also arises is how do we manage all this, right? Because previously, if everything was in one place, it was easier to manage everything, right? I mean, come on. Instead of it being in 1,000 applications, everything is in this one application. It's easier to manage. There are benefits of monolithic application because everything was in one place. Now, the moment you start to kind of make them distributed, or even for microservices. Christian actually has a book that talks about all this. You really have to think what you're doing, right? You can't just say, okay, take this one app or take this one integration and put into this 20 integrations now. Well, fine, but what are the boundaries? What is the transactionality? How do you log up? How do you monitor all of this? So I think these are really some challenges that you really have to think about and not just use them. So I think the thing that we're trying to say is that from an architecture perspective, you make sure that you have the tools that you need to make those choices, right? It's not necessarily saying that you have to be distributed all the time, but I mean, if there will be cases where putting everything into one place or everything into centralized will totally works for you. But as an architecture, you have a choice that, okay, if there are cases where you can now distribute or experiment with microservices, you have those choices and you can use the same technology. It's not that you have to reinvent your entire technology for that. So that's just my take. Again, it doesn't really answer the lock-in thing, but it's kind of more about how you go about doing this, more from an architecture perspective.
Any other questions out there? No questions? Oh, there's one in the middle, Fadi.
Yeah, actually, I have some different opinion for the distribution, the integration. So I was working for the integration world from the EAI, and then we put everything. So in the previously, each team has their own application, and they need to develop their own interface. But they don't have enough resource and then expertise. It's why whenever we ask them, like a billing team, hey, provide the interface. Then they need to hire the contractors and they implement it and they use it. It takes 3 months or 6 months. It's why in our case, we created some centralized integration team and then we build up the process and the standard API and then we put everything in the one platform. But if you're talking about the platform only, then I'm okay. So we also working on the containerized containerized platform, and then we want to deploy the interface module to others. But team and process-wise, I think I have a separate opinion about that.
And I agree with you, right? Because oftentimes, what I have seen, my experience has been that there's also this big thing about separation of concern, right? You have application teams, right, responsible for certain applications, and oftentimes when you go across those application boundaries, always the question is, where does that boundary lie? Where do you stop, right? And oftentimes, teams made those easy choices saying, okay, hey, ESB team or the centralized team, you make that call, okay? So from that ICC teams or centralized teams, what has happened in my experience over so many years is you have actually built this expertise, right? You know how to handle those distributed transactions. You know how to take care of when things go down, what to do. That's an incredibly hard problem to solve, right? And how do you maintain all this across different applications? Use that expertise is really important. It's not that it's going to go away, right? It's actually very important. But how do you use that expertise to now make sure that your application teams are now even more effective when they develop those applications? So when we talk about distributed integration, it's more about the capability that you have where when you're developing those new applications, your expertise that you have are now part of that application process itself. So you shouldn't be considered to be, okay, I'm going to develop my app. When I'm done, you are involved. No, you should be part of developing the app itself. When you're developing those apps, when you're creating those sets of services, you are actually the glue that is tying all these things together, right? Now, how do you want to deploy that? That's up to you and depending upon your organization. But now you have the flexibility and option to do it. That's kind of like our main idea around this.
And just real quick, I wanted to point out that I think the lines between what's an application developer and what's an integration developer are blurring. As we go more toward distributed architectures, we build our applications as APIs and as distributed systems. The application developers are going to have to be very, very, very aware and bring up their competencies in integration distributed systems in general.
Here's why. I think this is, there's a danger that as Samir said, there was this journey of everything was distributed, go back 10, 15 years ago, and then it kind of collapsed into this centralized model because distributed turns out it's really hard. And now we're back and we're saying, hey, you distribute everything, right? So probably everyone in the room is a little bit skeptical about that. But I think that while it's not perfect now, I think it's more deliberate, right? I think, and it's more, we're distributing knowledge as well, not just the actual architecture. So there is a lot of work to do. Just building distributed systems is hard, but almost every organization we work with is getting, they're multi-cloud, right? At least stuff in their basement plus on the cloud somewhere. So inherently, we're just in a different world, and there's many benefits. And I think hopefully some lessons have been learned, and a lot of it's around automation. How do you automate these processes so they really work? Having validation and testing in place, and educating the different teams that are running the components of your distributed system. But as Samir said, I think following the gospel of let's distribute everything, let's put APIs and microservices everywhere is just not helpful. You've got to think about where each makes sense.
One more thing, yeah. So
Sure.
You said it's application developers and then integration developers. So we have a blur boundary, but from my point of view, integration developer, they are focusing on their system. But the integration developer, we are focusing on on the API first, and how we can effectively implement API and let the customer use effectively. So anyway, yeah, agree with the comment. Thank you.
Yeah,
Just in general, the idea of, and maybe centralization is a bad word, or not a good description, but the more we try to silo the expertise and force these synchronizations between teams to get the job done causes bad behavior. I think as developers, if you don't have to worry about, or if you just say, well, I don't have to worry about testing because the testing team is going to do that, the quality assurance team is going to do that, I don't have to worry about integration as a different team that does that. We'll see what sprung the DevOps movement, right? It's the well, how do we share best practices across the organization? How do we make that accessible so that not everyone has to be a full stack developer or whatever, but you're sharing those best practices and at least making them aware of the system, not just your one little specialty.
yeah, I think in general, if you look at DevOps in general, you know, one of the core principles is fast flow of ideally single piece, single change, small batch size code going from the developer's head to production. And in order to enable the fastest flow possible, you try to minimize as many handoffs as you can. Every handoff builds a queue, and every time you get a queue, it slows it down. And so that's why we're starting to see the development of DevOps teams that are smaller, cross-trained individuals, integration and application developers, and they're combined with the testing team, possibly security's in there as well, and you get DevSecOps kind of emerging in the marketplace. But in general, people, we are moving to a model where we are all cross sort of trained people that can handle development and testing and accountable for every piece of change that goes from development to production. You know, 10 years ago, if you told me, I'm going to let my developer put something into production, I probably would have laughed. But nowadays, through technology and automated testing, that fast flow happens, and we've broken down the walls. And you'll see, I'll talk later this afternoon around, I think it's called the chronic conflict between development and operations and how you need to minimize that. That came out of the manufacturing movement in the 80s in the Toyota Kata kind of thing. So anyways, the new world is changing, and I'll be talking about that later on in my closing keynote. Anything else you want to add to that? I think we're coming up against the wall here. No? We might have time for one last quick question, or we can break to lunch earlier if you guys are hungry. Any questions out there? No? Okay. Well, I'll close the expert panel. Thank you so much, panelists, for that. Hopefully it's insightful for everybody.